The fire was not accidental. It was deliberate. And it was not just a fire. In a quiet corner of Warsaw, a Colombian national trained, funded, and deployed by Russian intelligence ignited two construction depots using Molotov cocktails, not to destroy infrastructure, but to send a message. This was not an isolated incident. It was a node in a much larger web, a strategy designed in Moscow, executed across borders, and targeted not at governments, but at civil societies. Poland, once viewed as a logistical waypoint in European commerce, has become something else entirely, a frontline state in the Kremlin's hybrid war. The details are disturbing, but predictable. The suspect, a 27-year-old Colombian, had already been convicted in the Czech Republic for a similar arson attack on a bus depot. Now, serving an 8-year sentence, he faces 10 years to life if convicted in Poland. He is one of over 30 individuals now detained in connection with Russia-backed sabotage operations, a network composed not just of Russians, but of Belarusians, Ukrainians, and even Polish nationals. The targets are not strategic military assets. They are symbols. Logistics centers, shopping malls, government buildings, bridges the connective tissue of a functioning society. This is not traditional warfare. It is psychological, and it is personal. The fire that gutted Warsaw's major shopping mall in May of last year was not just property damage. It was a strike on public morale, a calculated blow against societal confidence, a disruption of the mundane, engineered to feel spontaneous. But spontaneity is not a feature of the Russian military doctrine. It is a mask. This is the doctrine of chaos by design, part of what Russian strategists since the early 2010s have called new generation warfare, a blend of covert operations, cyber sabotage, disinformation, and civilian disruption. And Poland is not the end goal. It is the testing ground. From the Baltic states to the Balkans, from power grids in the United Kingdom to arson attacks in the Netherlands, Europe is being probed. Each act is deniable. Each attack subtle enough to avoid triggering NATO's collective defense mechanism, but potent enough to destabilize, to fragment, to demoralize. And yet, Poland has responded not with paralysis, but with investment in surveillance, in intelligence coordination, and in resilience. The Polish Prime Minister has drawn a clear line. Anyone, he says, who seeks to destabilize the country whether through sabotage or by undermining national institutions is serving the interests of Moscow, knowingly or otherwise. This framing matters. It means Poland is treating hybrid warfare not as a side effect, but as a battlefield. It is a statement that the threshold between peace and war is not drawn in bombs or treaties, but in intent, and that threshold is being tested every day. Only weeks ago, a Molotov cocktail was thrown by a migrant from the Belarusian side of the border at Polish guards. No injuries were reported, but the symbolism was unmistakable. Fire remains the favored weapon in this undeclared war, not because of its destructive power, but because of its visibility, because it creates fear. And fear, in strategic terms, is leverage. The Kremlin did not wait long to respond, and its answer was defiant. "We have taken note of President Trump's statement," a Russian spokesperson said, "but the special military operation continues." In other words, Moscow has no intention of halting its campaign in Ukraine. Not now, not under pressure, and not under deadline. Donald Trump's ultimatum issued from Scotland during a bilateral meeting with British Prime Minister Keir Starmer was clear: stop the attacks, or face consequences. But clarity in diplomacy does not always yield compliance. Overnight, Russia launched coordinated strikes on more than 70 Ukrainian cities and villages. The barrage included aerial bombs, long-range missiles, and tactical artillery. By dawn, 22 people were dead, 85 wounded. Among them, a pregnant 23-year-old woman killed in a strike that hit a hospital. Another strike, deeper near the Zaporizhzhia front line, obliterated a correctional facility. 16 were killed. dozens more injured. Eyewitness described chaos. Shattered limbs. Canteens engulfed in fire. Human screams beneath the dust and rubble. This was not a misfire. This was deliberate. And it was timed to send a message back to Washington. A message to Trump. The Russian pattern is evident. Escalate in response to pressure. Signal dominance through violence. And stall negotiations by presenting force as fact. Trump, in return, has shortened the deadline. No longer weeks. Now days. Between the 7th and 9th of August. That is the window. If Russia does not halt its offensive, if Vladimir Putin does not agree to a ceasefire, the White House has promised major repercussions. What form those repercussions might take is still unclear, but clues can be found in the parallel negotiations with Europe, particularly in Brussels. Germany, Norway, and other European Union nations have agreed to purchase $10 billion worth of new weapon systems from the United States. In exchange, they will transfer existing weapons stockpiles to Ukraine. This is not charity. It is leverage. It strengthens Ukraine's tactical position and deepens Europe's military dependence on American defense contractors. The message to Russia is implicit. The West is not running out of ammunition, and it is not negotiating from weakness. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has echoed that signal, publicly affirming that he is willing to end the war immediately, if and only if Putin agrees to a verifiable ceasefire. Each additional death, he says, is evidence that Moscow deserves truly painful sanctions, not symbolic ones, but financial instruments designed to pressure the Kremlin into compliance. And yet, Russia insists it remains committed to the peace process. While launching bombs, this contradiction is not rhetorical. It is structural. It reveals the Kremlin's belief that peace can only be achieved on its terms, through attrition. This is the logic of limited war. Push just far enough to gain leverage, without triggering a full-scale Western military response. But Donald Trump's threshold appears to be narrowing. His language is shifting from dialogue to deterrence. And in Eastern Europe, deterrence is no longer a theoretical concept. It is being stress-tested in real time. Amid air raid sirens and missile debris, Polish business owners are crossing the border, not to flee, but to rebuild. Nearly 300 Polish companies have opened inside Ukraine since February of 2022. Despite the war, despite the risks, despite the very real possibility that everything they build could be destroyed in seconds. This is not just commerce. It is strategy. For entrepreneurs like Paweł Paki, whose factory in Kyiv was reduced to ash by a Russian missile, the calculus is personal. He is not retreating. He is expanding. Paki is not alone. He employs Ukrainian women who refuse to leave, who chose to work, to generate wealth, to anchor their country's economic survival. His next factory, a new location, a new risk will open in weeks. It is called Operation Phoenix. And like the myth it references, the message is clear. Destruction is not defeat. Rebirth is resistance. This model investment as defiance has become a central pillar of Poland's engagement with Ukraine. Over 3,000 Polish firms were already operating in Ukraine prior to the war. Now, that number is growing. So is the political capital behind it. On Tuesday, Polish lawmaker Paweł Kowal traveled to Ukraine, not to tour damage, but to negotiate expansion. His delegation met with Ukrainian officials in Lviv and Kyiv. The goal: incentivize more Polish investment, backed by preferential loans, war insurance, and government support. The logic is pragmatic. Supporting Ukraine's economic viability is not only a gesture of solidarity, it is a shield against regional instability. Each Polish business that remains operational in Ukraine, each job that is preserved, each shipment that crosses the border, reduces the Kremlin's margin of success, and the numbers support the strategy. In 2024, Polish exports to Ukraine surpassed 10 billion euros. More is expected in 2025. This is not accidental. It reflects a broader understanding in Warsaw that Poland's security is not just military, it is economic, and that Ukraine's collapse would not be a distant failure, but a direct threat. For many Polish investors, this is about more than profit. It is about precedent, because Poland remembers what it means to face an existential threat and to stand largely alone. Unlike parts of Western Europe, Poland does not perceive the war in Ukraine as distant or abstract. It sees it as a mirror, a preview of what might unfold in its own cities if the current front line collapses. This proximity, geographic, cultural, and historical, drives a level of engagement that often surprises outside observers. But to Poles, the rationale is simple. If Ukraine survives, Poland is safer. And if Ukraine falls, there may be no buffer left. Wars are not won by goodwill alone. They are won by preparation. And Poland is preparing aggressively. On the final Tuesday of July, Poland became the 10th European Union member state to formally apply for a defense loan under the bloc's new security framework. The requested amount, 45 billion euros. This is not symbolic. The funds are earmarked for a spectrum of military upgrades, procurement of ammunition, missile systems, electronic warfare capabilities, and most importantly, the construction of a 700-kilometer defensive wall spanning Poland's eastern border with Belarus and the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad. The project is known as the Eastern Shield. It is not a metaphor. It is a concrete manifestation of Poland's new security doctrine, one that views its borders not as administrative boundaries, but as potential battle lines. According to Defense Minister Władysław Kosiniak-Kamysz, this investment serves three parallel objectives. It strengthens Poland's armed forces, it fortifies the European Union's eastern perimeter, and it boosts the domestic defense industry, building not just weapons, but capacity. The funding will be drawn from the EU's SAFE program, a 150 billion euro pool, designed to accelerate military readiness across member states. To date, 10 countries have formally applied. The Commission expects at least 20 by the final deadline in November. These loans are not handouts. They are strategic accelerants. They enable nations like Poland, already spending above NATO's 3.5% GDP benchmark, to scale faster, to meet emerging threats not in 5 years, but in 5 months. But they also do something else. They shift the internal geometry of Europe's defense architecture, because not all member states are equally committed. Some, particularly in Western Europe, have been slower to allocate resources, slower to adapt to the post-2022 reality, slower to acknowledge that the continent is already under attack, not by conventional armies, but by drones, hackers, infiltrators. Poland's application is not just a request for funds. It is a statement of priorities. It is a declaration that deterrence is no longer theoretical. It is material. And that deterrence must be visible to allies and adversaries alike. The Eastern Shield is part infrastructure, part theater, and both are necessary, because Russia does not fear words. It fears consequences. And as Poland builds its walls, it also builds its role. No longer just a border state, it is becoming a strategic hinge linking NATO's northern posture to its southern flank, bridging American logistics with European territory, and standing as the first line of defense in a war that remains undeclared, but unmistakably underway. Not all threats arrive with a flag or a manifesto. Sometimes they come in the form of water. In late July, southern Poland endured 2 days of relentless rain, turning rural streams into rivers and rivers into weapons. In the Silesia region, bridge collapsed. Entire streets were submerged. Fire crews deployed sandbags to shield homes. But in many areas, it was not enough. 800 emergency calls were made in a single district. 3,000 incidents were logged nationwide. And yet, there was no panic. No breakdown. No systemic failure. The Polish state responded with coordination, precision, and force. 2,000 soldiers were placed on standby. Military engineers worked alongside civilian authorities, deploying logistical support where needed, securing critical infrastructure. By the end of the second day, water levels in Silesia had dropped by 1.5 meters. Attention shifted north, where new rains threatened hospitals and residential zones. But the system held, not because of luck, but because of structure. The flood response showcased more than crisis management. It revealed a form of national discipline, a civil-military synergy rarely discussed in Western media. This is not unique to Poland, but it is acute here, because for Poland, resilience is not a theory. It is a policy imperative. Whether facing arson by foreign saboteurs, airborne missiles across the Ukrainian border, or rising waters in the countryside, the state is preparing for compound threats, and compound threats require layered solutions. Floods test infrastructure. They expose fragility. They reveal where capacity ends and where improvisation must begin. But Poland's flood response was not improvised. It was rehearsed. And that distinction matters. Because in a hybrid warfare environment where civilian life is the battlefield, any weakness is exploitable. Any delay is a vector. Any failure is a signal. The Kremlin watches these responses. So do NATO planners. They are measuring not just how Poland defends itself from fire, but how it withstands pressure, from within and without. This is the essence of national readiness. Not simply possessing weapons, but maintaining cohesion. And cohesion is forged not only in wartime, but in waterlogged fields, in emergency centers, in the calm execution of contingency plans. In Poland, the line between domestic safety and national defense is disappearing, and the state is adapting. Because the next war, if it escalates, will not begin with tanks. It will begin with floods, fires, and failure. Poland is preparing for all three. Wars are not always declared. Sometimes they are discovered, not in official communiqué, but in burnt warehouses, in severed cables, in frightened civilians who cannot explain why everything around them suddenly stopped working. This is hybrid warfare, not a new doctrine, but a refinement of old instincts updated for the information age. And in Poland, its impact is becoming harder to ignore. 32 suspects have been detained: Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Poles. Their mission: sabotage. Their tools: fire, misinformation, and disruption. But their objective is singular: destabilization. According to analysts at the Terrorism Research Center in Warsaw, this is war without open confrontation, conflict without uniforms, pressure applied below the threshold that would trigger a NATO response. It is strategic ambiguity, weaponized. Poland does not retaliate with covert attacks inside Russian territory. It restrains itself, not out of weakness, but because the moment it responds in kind, it risks escalation. And escalation in this context means war. But the Kremlin's hybrid strategy forces uncomfortable questions. At what point does sabotage become terrorism? At what point does interference become invasion? Where is the red line? The answer is deliberately unclear. That is the nature of the design. To prevent clear thresholds, to confuse cause and effect, to paralyze decision-makers through ambiguity. Because if you cannot prove who attacked, if the operative was Colombian, if the arsonist was Belarusian, then how do you assign blame? And if you cannot assign blame, how do you justify response? This is not new. It is the same ambiguity that preceded the annexation of Crimea, the same vagueness that clouded the Donbass insurgency, the same deniability that shielded cyber attacks on Western parliaments, and the same logic now being deployed against Poland. Strategists call this plausible deniability. But the consequences are very real. Infrastructure burns. Transport networks are photographed for sabotage. Public trust is corroded. And behind it all, a state actor masked by civilians, or by people who appear to be civilians. This model bypasses the old mechanisms of international law. There is no declaration, no invasion, no formal enemy. only damage. And in the absence of clarity, Western democracies struggle to calibrate response. Because war as defined by conventional treaties has not been declared. But what if the definition no longer applies? What if the battlefield is not military but societal? Not geographic but informational? This is the new front line. And it is not just Poland. From sabotage networks in France, to cyber intrusions in Germany, to misinformation campaigns in the United States, the tactics are repeating. They are modular, scalable, and tested. For countries like Poland, the only defense is to adapt faster than the threat evolves, to train the public as sensors, to modernize surveillance without sacrificing liberty, to build redundancy into every system. Because if resilience fails, deterrence fails next. And deterrence is the last line. Poland is now that line, not just for itself, but for Europe. It is not merely absorbing the shock of hybrid war. It is setting the precedent for how to survive it, and perhaps how to win.